Holy Gospel of our Savior Jesus Christ according to Matthew.
Glory be to thee, O Lord.
Jesus put before the crowds another parable. The kingdom of heaven may be compared to someone who sowed good seed in his field. But while everybody was asleep, an enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat, and then went away. So when the plants came up and bore grain, then the weeds appeared as well. And the slaves of the householder came and said to him, Master, did you not sow good seed in your field? Where then did these weeds come from? He answered, An enemy has done this. The slave said to him, Then do you want us to go and gather them? But he replied, No. For in gathering the weeds, you would uproot the wheat along with them. Let both of them grow together until the harvest. And at harvest time, I will tell the reapers, Collect the weeds first, and bind them in bundles to be burned, but gather the wheat into my barn. Then Jesus left the crowds and went into the house. And his disciples approached him, saying, Explain to us the parable of the weeds of the field. He answered, The one who sows the good seed is the Son of Man. The field is the world. And the good seed are the children of the kingdom. The weeds are the children of the evil one, and the enemy who sowed them is the devil. The harvest is the end of the age, and the reapers are angels. Just as the weeds are collected and burned up with fire, so will it be at the end of the age. The Son of Man will send his angels, and they will collect out of his kingdom all causes of sin and all evildoers, and they will throw them into the furnace of fire, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. Let anyone with ears listen. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise be to thee, O Christ.
Peace be still. So I'm a little bit of a mind reader. Tell me if I've got it right. You were thinking about the people in your life who are weeds. And you were thinking, I know she's a weed. I have a feeling they might be weeds. And then you started imagining them getting picked up by angels and dropped into the pile to be burned. Is anybody thinking about who might be weeds? I see people shaking their heads no. Good for you. Because that's where my mind goes first. Not so much just picking people, but to sort of imagining, given this parable, who in my life might be weeds? There's one problem with this concept, and that is, I'm going to ask you another question. Has anybody ever thought of you as a weed in their life? Now, see, like, if you think of them as weeds and they think of you as weeds, then at the end of time, will there be anybody left? Because honestly, is any of us completely perfect and completely without sin? Then you really are a weed in this concept. And that means that in the end, you really will be picked up and there really will be nobody left. Which is why I think maybe, possibly, and probably, this parable is not about people. This parable is instead about society and why there is evil in the world. Why does sin exist at all? Why does evil exist at all? Why are there systems in our world at all that cause harm? If God planted a good and perfect world, then where did all this stuff come from? And is it our job right now to try to find every last bit of it and tear it up by the roots? Years ago, I was a camp counselor. Loved being a camp counselor. Sometimes I still think of myself as a camp counselor. Forgive me for that. But it was an amazing, amazing job. It was a Christian summer camp. I was there for 8 summers. I was a counselor, a junior counselor, an administrator, the assistant director for several years. And I'm thinking particularly about a child who we were all pretty sure was a weed. His name was Curtis, and he was probably in about 3rd grade. And I'll tell you what, you couldn't put Curtis into a cabin without having those counselors tearing their hair out by the end of the first day. They would come to me as the section head or as the assistant, and they would have tears in their eyes. They were absolutely exhausted by this terrible, terrible child. Now, what makes a child terrible? Well, in this case, there was several things about Curtis. One was he loved to fight. Now, I don't know if he loved to fight, but he fought often. Let's put it that way. And he fought with every ounce of his being. You know how we start the service with love God with all your heart, mind, and soul and strength? This guy fought with all his heart and mind and soul and strength. It was so bad that Curtis would be going after other kids, and the counselors would have to pick him up to separate them, and in the air, his feet were still moving, and his arms were still reaching. And the counselors would realize, as soon as I put this kid down, he's like a road runner, you drop him and go straight back to the kid. You can't carry him for the whole week. What do you do with a kid that you can't put down because he's going to attack the other person? It wasn't the only thing about Curtis. We'd be in a big group, we'd be trying to do something, Curtis would stand up and walk away. He'd just get up and go. And people would go to Curtis and say, you gotta come back. I don't have to go back. They would go to get him, he'd run. Curtis would be at the waterfront, and we would be trying to do this thing. Everybody had a number. It's like, you say 1, you say 2, you say 3. We all count up to 30. We know we're all here. Curtis would be playing in the sand. We say, get your hands out of the sand. You got to say your number. His hands would go right back into the sand. He would forget his number. People would think Curtis was gone. We'd have to look. There he is, number 27, just sitting there making a sandcastle. Curtis was so difficult. This was the kid, if you ever wanted to say there was a bad kid, Curtis was the bad kid. But we always would have to sort of stop and say, but are there bad kids? Are there bad human beings, or is there bad behavior? And to separate in our mind the difference between the human being, the child of God, and the behavior that was making things so bad. And in this sense, to have critique of the behavior, but compassion for the human being. Because what we didn't realize, and we were sort of young and naive about these things, was Curtis was from a community that was a community of poverty in just about every way you could imagine. Economic poverty, to be sure, but also a poverty of attention. Curtis had been ignored almost his entire life. A poverty of investment in education. The systems of education there, the resources that the teachers had, the number of teachers there were, the number of students in a classroom were absolutely out of whack, especially for children who needed so much attention. There was a poverty of economic investment. There was a poverty of concern. There was a poverty of attention from the rest of the world on this community. Curtis was from a place where on every side in his life, he had been robbed of the things that he needed to grow up into a strong and healthy and peaceful, 3rd grader full of peace, right? And full of self-assuredness and confidence, and full of an ability to connect well with others. It occurred to us later that part of the thing that Curtis might have been reacting against was all the compassion he was getting. Because it was hard for him to believe he deserved it, and he knew that in about 4 days, he was never going to have it again. The difference between bad people, the people we're thinking of as weeds, and the systems of injustice that harm and corrupt the children of God. What Jesus is telling us is that these systems exist. And the problem is that as sometimes when we try to attack the systems, we end up attacking the people instead. Wars on poverty often turn into wars on the poor. Okay? Wars on these neighborhoods to try to get them to sort of shape up end up being wars on the neighbors. Wars on mental illness too often end up being wars on the mentally ill. We try to cut people off, or we try to force them into behavior that would be better, and what we end up doing is taking away resources that they were counting on already to survive. The few things that were giving them the rare opportunity to thrive. This is why Jesus is saying today, he's saying the systems of evil in the world are so intermeshed with the people in the world that sometimes if we try to root up the things that are evil, we're going to end up tearing up the people as well. We're going to end up harming those who are a part of those systems, not just attacking those systems. So what are we supposed to do? Well, what Jesus tells us in today's parable is that rather than focusing on the weeds, to focus on the wheat. Rather than trying to tear out the weeds, to focus on investing on the wheat. Helping the wheat to become as strong as it can be. Imagine in these organizations if the attention, and these communities and these neighborhoods, if the attention was just on the kids, right? Rather than trying to fight all of these negative things, what if it was about investment in the people? We're going to spend our energy not trying to create rules to discipline them or to force them into good behavior, but we're going to focus on resources and on opportunities of giving people everything that they need to thrive. And you know what? If somebody isn't able to fully do it, maybe their children will be able to. To focus on investing in the wheat so the wheat can become as strong as possible. And Jesus says at the end of time, that's when it will be very easy to separate the things one from another. We see God himself doing this today in our first lesson. This passage about Jacob and Jacob's ladder. That's why we sang that first hymn today, that tricky first hymn. About the ladder that reaches up into heaven. Jacob is a jerk. Jacob is a terrible human being. Everything that Jacob has done from the beginning that we've heard stories about him have been things that are really, really bad. Jacob is so bad that in January when I have sermons on questions and I say, what are your questions? I'll answer your questions. Every couple of years someone says, why does God pick Jacob? Because he's a cheater and he's a manipulator and he's a user of other people. Jacob tricks his brother. Jacob tricks his father. You don't know these stories or you don't know them too well. He tricks his brother out of his birthright because he's hungry and says, well, I'll give you my bowl of soup if you make me the heir to everything that is our father's. And the guy hasn't eaten in 3 days. He says, just give me the soup. No soup unless you give me your birthright. And then, as if that wasn't enough, when his father, Isaac, is like dying and it wants to give his blessing, you know what Jacob does? His brother's hairy. Jacob takes a wolf skin and puts it on his arm so that his arm can be really hairy. It's supposed to sort of be funny because, does anyone's arm that hairy? Like wolf skin? He goes into his blind father, pretends like he's his brother, says that he's Esau, even though he's not, he's Jacob, acts like Esau so that Isaac will give him the blessing of God to officially make him the heir. Not only that Esau sold it away, but then the father bestowed it. This is the kind of person that Jacob is. If there's a bad human being in Genesis, well, there's a few, and in that small crowd, there we're going to put Jacob. But look at what God does for Jacob today. Before, as far as I can tell, Jacob has done very much to deserve it. Jacob is having a dream, and what does Jacob dream about? Jacob dreams of this ladder that reaches all the way up to heaven. And in this ladder, there's angels coming up and down, and the next thing he knows, God is next to him. And what does God do? Put him in a headlock? Give him a noogie and say everything he did was terrible? No, because God knows that by trying to sort of rid Jacob of the sin, he's going to destroy Jacob himself. What God does is he invests in him. God says, I believe in you, Jacob. I trust you, Jacob. Here I am standing before you, Jacob, and I'm going to give you the blessing. He gives him this opportunity to sort of to rise up, to prove himself, right? I believe in you. Stand up and prove me right, God is saying. Stand up and become the person that I've made you to be. I know what is inside of you. I know what you've done, and I know what you can do. So stand up and be strong. Take courage. Muster up all of your best and most noble qualities, and go and be somebody different, Jacob. And tomorrow be a little better than you were today, and become the person that I have called you to be. It's an investment in the weeds. With the trust that as the wheat grows tall and strong, the weeds will necessarily be smaller and less numerous and ultimately less powerful. Curtis became my favorite camper. He came back year after year, and it turned out that the love was really what he needed. Now, I'm not assuming that 1 week in the summer is what changed Curtis, right? I think a lot of people were watching this child. I think a lot of people were paying attention to what he needed. And I think a lot of people in his system, including his Episcopal church, identified him as someone who needed moral and ethical and spiritual and compassionate investment. And they did. And Curtis came back year after year. He had the most marvelous smile. He fought less. He played in the sand less. It turns out some of those things are things that some third graders do, and he sort of grew out of them. And he became, slowly but surely, at least in our eyes, one of the most extraordinary examples of sort of Christ at work in a heart. I wish I knew where Curtis was today. If anybody knows where Curtis is, these get recorded later. Let me know, because it's been some years, and I would love to see him again. In your world, if you focus on pulling out all the weeds, then who's going to concentrate on the weeds? I'm going to blow your mind here by making it just clear bottom line. All human beings are wheat. All human beings are wheat. Your enemy is wheat. The people who hate you are wheat. They're not weeds. What if you invested in them? What if you invested in their wheatness? What if, despite all those things, you shined on them with love? Would that make their wheat a little stronger and the weeds around them just a little less powerful? What if you invested in them with confidence? What if you invested in them with trust? What if you gave them opportunities? They might break them. Did you ever break an opportunity? We're no better than one another. By focusing your positive attention on the people in your world, they will rise up, they will begin to shine, and those other things will fall down around them. And I'm going to tell you one thing more. You might also want to look inside. Because we established at the beginning of the sermon that every single one of you got weeds growing somewhere in your soul. And you've got all kinds of wheat going too. Don't destroy yourself over those weeds. Don't flagellate yourself like the monks did in the Middle Ages because you did something wrong. Focus on your weakness. Invest in your goodness. Trust your godliness. Invest in your love. Show it more and give it more and feed it more. And watch it grow up to great big heads full of grain with all sorts of seeds to grow more wheat in your soul. Jesus makes us a promise in today's gospel, and that is that it won't always be this way. At the end of time, God will send out his angels, and those angels are going to come around, and now that we're all ripe, they're going to pluck out from amongst us and between us and from within us all those things that have caused sin, all of those things that are doers of evil. They will all be rid from us. And in that day alone, will we be able to stand up tall and to shine like the sun in the kingdom of our Father. And the more we can start to do that today,